You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Plato of Athens stands as one of the most influential figures in Western philosophy. A student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle, Plato wrote in unique dialogue form that blends drama with profound inquiry. His work spanned ethics, political philosophy, psychology, epistemology, and metaphysics. Through vivid characters, often Socrates, and imaginative stories or myths, Plato explored enduring questions about justice, reality, knowledge, love, the soul, and the ideal society. This episode delves into Plato's major dialogues and philosophical ideas, from the historical trials of Socrates to the visionary theory of forms and the famous allegory of the cave, and drawing on scholarly insights to enrich our understanding. We have journeyed through Plato's life and times, and now we will examine the key themes of his early, middle, and late dialogues and discover how his blend of dramatic dialogue and philosophical exploration created a living legacy that still shapes thought today. His real name was Aristocles, but he became known as Plato, perhaps a nickname referring to his broad physique or broad forehead. Growing up during the Peloponnesian War, the young Plato witnessed the political instability of Athens. In his 20s, Plato became a devoted student of the philosopher Socrates, whose method of questioning everything left a deep mark on him. Socrates' charismatic quest for truth and his martyr-like death were defining influences. In 399 BCE, the Athenian democracy tried and executed Socrates for impiety and corrupting the youth. Plato, then about 28, was profoundly affected by the loss of his mentor. The Apology, Plato's earliest dialogue, is actually an account of Socrates' defense speech at the trial, and through it, Plato ensures Socrates' voice and ideals would live on. After Socrates' death, Plato withdrew from Athens for a time, traveling perhaps to Megara, Cyrene in North Africa, Italy, and Egypt. These travels exposed him to other philosophies, such as Pythagoreans in Italy, that would inform his later work. Around 387 BCE, Plato returned to Athens and founded the Academy, often considered the first university. The Academy was an institution for higher learning situated in a grove of olive trees sacred to the hero Academus, just outside Athens. There, Plato taught and engaged students in dialogue for decades. Among the Academy's most illustrious students was Aristotle, who studied there for 20 years. The Academy became Plato's home base for the rest of his life. Plato also made at least 2 more trips to Sicily in hopes of guiding Syracusan tyrants, Dionysius the Elder and the Younger. In his later years, Plato concentrated on teaching and writing at the Academy until his death in 347 BCE. Understanding Plato's historical context enriches our appreciation of his dialogues. He lived through the decline of Athenian democracy and the rise of Macedonian power, through war and civil strife, through the trial of Socrates and its aftermath. These experiences gave Plato a first-hand view of political instability and moral uncertainty, fueling his desire to find unshakable truths and better ways to order society. The figure of Socrates, questioning, ironic, unyielding in his pursuit of virtue, dominates Plato's early works and remains a touchstone throughout. In a sense, Plato's philosophy can be seen as his attempt to preserve Socrates' spirit while also moving beyond Socratic skepticism to construct a positive philosophical system. To achieve this, Plato wrote in an inventive dialogue form that invites the reader into the debate. Before diving into the content of the dialogues, let us briefly consider the distinctive method of philosophical writing. Nearly all of Plato's surviving works are written as dialogues, conversations between characters, often historical figures, probing philosophical questions. Rather than writing treatises or lectures, Plato presents philosophy in a dramatic format, complete with settings and characters, which gives his work a rich literary texture. We meet Socrates debating in an Athenian marketplace, or conversing at a drinking party, or talking quietly in prison before his death. These dialogues are not plays meant for the stage, but they are carefully crafted dramas of ideas. Plato's gift for vivid characterization and setting, a jubilant symposium, a gymnasium, the courtroom, or the shadows of a cave, makes abstract ideas come alive as human experience. Socrates is the central figure in most dialogues. He is present in all of them except one, the laws. Through Socrates, Plato honors his mentor's legacy, but also uses him as a mouthpiece for exploring Plato's own ideas. Importantly, Plato never speaks in his own voice in the dialogues. There is no Professor Plato explaining his doctrine. Instead, he lets arguments unfold through questions and answers, the Socratic method of inquiry. Socrates, or another lead character, poses questions to others, refutes flawed answers, and gradually guides the discussion towards deeper understanding. This method showcases philosophy as a live process of questioning assumptions. It also means Plato's works often don't present doctrines neatly, but rather lead readers to think for themselves. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes, Plato is far more exploratory, incompletely systematic, elusive, and playful than philosophers like Aristotle or Kant. He does not hand us a finalized system of thought. Instead, many dialogues end inconclusively or even with more puzzles. Plato seems to want the reader to participate in the inquiry. Readers of a Platonic dialogue are drawn into thinking for themselves about the issues raised, provoking a sense of philosophy as a living and unfinished subject to which they must contribute. This open-ended dialectical style is deliberate. Plato often raises profound questions. What is virtue? What is justice? Is the soul immortal? And examines them from multiple sides without always reaching a final answer. In Euthyphro, Socrates and a priest struggle to define piety and end in perplexity. In Theaetetus, Socrates and a young mathematician explore what is knowledge and consider, then critique, definitions like knowledge is sense perception or knowledge is true belief with an account, ultimately concluding they have not yet found a satisfactory definition. In Parmenides, an elder philosopher, Parmenides, subjects young Socrates' theory of forms to relentless criticism, raising problems of infinite regress and logical contradiction that are left unresolved. Rather than weaken the dialogue, these unanswered puzzles are the point. Plato is teaching us to think, not merely telling us what to think. As one scholar observes, Plato's work gives us a few key ideas along with a series of suggestions and problems about how those ideas are to be interrogated, leaving further work for the readers themselves. This dynamic quality is why Plato is often considered the ideal introduction to philosophy. The dialogues don't just preset doctrines, they demonstrate the activity of philosophical inquiry. Despite the variety in topics and tones across Plato's dialogues, it is common to divide them into three broad groups: early, middle, and late dialogues. These early dialogues are closest to the historical Socrates in style and focus mainly on ethical questions, often ending without a firm conclusion. The middle dialogues mark the development of Plato's own philosophical theories. Here we see the introduction of his theory of forms, discussions of the soul's immortality, the nature of knowledge, love, and the ideal state. These works still feature Socrates as a protagonist, but are generally thought to convey Plato's views more than Socrates. Finally, the late dialogues are more technical and often involve new characters or a diminished role for Socrates. In the late period, Plato revisits and sometimes revises ideas from the middle period. For example, Parmenides critically examines the form theory. Sophists and statesmen introduce an Iliadic stranger as the main interlocutor instead of Socrates, and Laws presents a practical political philosophy without Socrates at all. With this orientation to Plato's method and the rough chronology of his works, we can now explore some of his major dialogues and ideas in more depth. We will proceed loosely in chronological order of the dialogues, beginning with those that center on Socrates' trial and teachings, moving through the middle dialogues where Plato's distinctive doctrines emerge, and ending with the later works. We will proceed loosely in chronological order of the dialogues, beginning with those that center on Socrates' trial and teachings, moving through the middle dialogues where Plato's distinctive doctrines emerge, and ending with the later works. Plato's earliest dialogues depict the final days of Socrates and introduce core Socratic principles of ethics. The apology of Socrates is not an apology in the modern sense, but an apologia, a defense speech. Plato presents Socrates at age 70 standing before the 501-man Athenian jury in 399 BCE to answer charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. The scene is historic, and Plato likely witnessed it in person. In the dialogue, Socrates delivers an unyielding defense of his life, devoted to questioning and virtue. He famously compares himself to a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athens, trying to rouse the city to self-examination. He recounts how his friend Chaerephon asked the Delphic oracle if anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle replied no one was wiser. Socrates interpreted this as a divine mission. He was only wise insofar as he knew that he knew nothing, whereas others falsely believed themselves wise. Thus he went about examining politicians, poets, and craftsmen, exposing their ignorance, which earned him powerful enemies. In the Apology, Plato's Socrates defiantly refuses to give up philosophizing, even if it means death. "I owe a greater obedience to God than to you," Socrates tells the jurors, insisting he will continue to question anyone he meets about virtue and truth. He admonishes the court that killing him will harm Athens more than it harms him. "For you will not easily find anyone to take my place in urging the city toward goodness." Socrates even rejects the usual emotional appeals for mercy, refusing to parade his family in court or weep for pity. Such tactics, he implies, would betray his principles. Ultimately, the jury convicts Socrates by a narrow vote and sentences him to death. Socrates accepts the verdict with equanimity. In a parting shot, he tells the jurors that nothing can harm a good man either in life or after death, and that his own pursuit of virtue means even death cannot truly hurt him. One of the most iconic moments in Apology is when Socrates declares that if they offered to acquit him on the condition that he ceases philosophizing, he would decline, for the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. As he puts it, "To let no day pass without discussing goodness and all the other subjects is really the very best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living." This ringing statement, "the unexamined life is not worth living," has echoed through history as a call to reflection and critical thinking. Plato's Apology, though essentially a monologue, sets the stage for the themes of moral integrity, the quest for truth, and the tension between the philosopher and society. Two other early dialogues, Euthyphro and Crito, complement the Apology by showing Socrates' attitude before and after the trial. In Euthyphro, set just before Socrates' hearing, Socrates encounters a zealously religious man, Euthyphro, and they debate the nature of piety, holiness. Socrates, about to be prosecuted for impiety, playfully yet seriously questions Euthyphro, who claims to know the will of the gods. They examine whether something is pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is pious, a question that introduces a classic dilemma about the grounding of morality. The dialogue ends without a clear answer, but it demonstrates Socrates' method of probing definition and reveals the difficulty of pinning down moral concepts. Euthyphro leaves the reader with a sharpened sense of the question rather than a solution, which is characteristic of the early Socratic dialogues. After the trial, Cicero takes us to Socrates' prison cell as he awaits execution. His old friend Crito arrives at dawn, offering a plan to smuggle Socrates out to safety. Here, Plato dramatizes a stark moral choice. Should Socrates break the law and escape to save his life, or accept the legal judgment even if it was unjust? Crito implores Socrates to flee for the sake of his children and his friends' reputations. They don't want to be seen as not trying to save him. Socrates, however, engages Crito in a dialogue about justice. Would it be right to repay injustice with another injustice? Socrates concludes it would not. He personifies the laws of Athens in a speech, sometimes called the Speech of the Laws, where they argue that Socrates, by choosing to live in Athens, agreed to abide by its laws and that escaping would harm the city's legal order. One must obey the commands of one's city and country, Socrates says in essence, even if the city errs in one's individual case. In the end, Socrates remains in prison, choosing fidelity to the law and his principles over life. Crito thus highlights Socrates' integrity. He will not compromise his ethics for convenience, reinforcing the image of Socrates as a martyr for the rule of law and philosophy. Together, Apology, Euthyphro, and Crito paint a compelling portrait of Socrates, a man guided by conscience and reason, fearless in the face of death, committed to seeking virtue above all else. These works also set up many of the big questions Plato will tackle more abstractly later. What is justice? What is piety? How should a person live? They provide the dramatic and moral backdrop for Plato's subsequent explorations. Notably, these earlier dialogues do not introduce Plato's own metaphysical doctrines. There is no talk of forms or an afterlife or cosmology yet, except in passing. That changes with the dialogues that Plato wrote in the next phase, which begin to venture beyond Socratic ethics into deeper philosophical waters. An important transitional dialogue is the Meno, which bridges Socratic ethics and Plato's emerging ideas on knowledge. Meno begins with a straightforward Socratic question: can virtue be taught? Meno, a young aristocrat, first asks Socrates whether virtue, arete, excellence, is teachable, but quickly the discussion shifts to a more basic puzzle. What is virtue? Socrates insists they must define virtue before deciding how it's acquired. Meno proposes a few definitions. Virtue for a man is managing public affairs well. for a woman managing the home well, and etc. But Socrates refutes them, seeking a single definition that covers all virtues. Meno grows frustrated and compares Socrates to a torpedo fish that numbs whoever comes near. He feels paralyzed and unable to answer. This leads to Meno's paradox. How can you search for knowledge of something when you don't know what it is? If you know it, you don't need to search. If you don't know it, you wouldn't recognize it even if you found it. Socrates responds with a bold idea that becomes a cornerstone of Platonic thought, the theory of recollection. He suggests that the soul is immortal and has learned all things in past lives, so what we call learning is merely recollecting what the soul already knows at some deeper level. To demonstrate, Socrates famously calls over an enslaved boy and through questioning alone, without giving answers, leads the boy to work out a geometry problem, doubling the area of a square. The boy, who has no formal education, eventually arrives at the correct solution, which Socrates takes as evidence that this knowledge was latent in him all along. This implies that true knowledge is innate and awakening it requires proper questioning. In Meno, this idea is still presented as a hypothesis, linked to a mythic account of reincarnation. But it marks the first appearance of Plato's belief in an eternal soul and in a reality of knowledge beyond the empirical world, notions that will be fully developed soon. To the question, can virtue be taught? Meno ends somewhat ambiguously. Socrates and Meno reach a provisional conclusion that virtue comes not from teaching, since no one can point to a reliable teacher of virtue, nor simply from nature, but perhaps by a sort of divine gift or inspiration. The dialogue thus leaves us with a tantalizing suggestion that virtue ultimately requires right opinion granted by the gods, or as Plato might later frame it, knowledge of the good itself, but it stops short of articulating the full theory. In essence, Meno poses the problems that Plato's later philosophy will answer. It asks about the nature of virtue and knowledge, and hints that answers lie in understanding the immortal soul and its knowledge of eternal truths. These themes come into fruition in Phaedo, one of Plato's richest and most revered dialogues. Phaedo is set on the final day of Socrates' life, as Socrates sits in his prison cell in the company of friends, calmly awaiting the poisoned hemlock. Phaedo, a young fellow, recounts the scene to others afterwards, lending the dialogue a poignant narrative frame. Phaedo is both a character and the narrator of the story. This dialogue combines dramatic power, the depiction of Socrates' last hours, with profound philosophical argument. It is in Phaedo that Plato first lays out his own metaphysical and epistemological doctrines in a clear way, so much so the ancient commentators nicknamed the dialogue On the Soul. The Phaedo covers three main topics: the immortality of the soul, the theory of recollection, further developed from Meno, and most importantly, the theory of forms. Plato's most famous contribution to philosophy, presented here arguably for the first time. The dramatic context is that Socrates' friends, saddened by his impending death, ask him why he seems unafraid. This prompts Socrates to explain why a true philosopher should not fear death. He argues that philosophy is essentially a preparation for dying, because it involves separating the soul as much as possible from the bodily desires and senses in order to attain knowledge of eternal truths. The soul, Socrates claims, is immortal, and death is merely the soul's separation from the body. To this support, he offers four arguments for the soul's immortality. 1. The cyclical argument. Opposites come from opposites, so life must come from death, as death comes from life, implying an endless cycle. 2. The theory of recollection. Learning is recollecting eternal truths, which suggests the soul existed before birth to acquire that knowledge. 3. The affinity argument. The soul is invisible, non-composite, and divine-like the forms, so it naturally survives the death of the body. And later, 4. The final argument drawing on the form of life. The soul always brings life and thus cannot admit death. In the course of these arguments, Plato introduces forms explicitly. For example, he speaks of the equal itself, the beautiful itself, the just itself, abstract ideals that are grasped not by the senses but by the mind. At one point, Socrates asks, how do we even form the concept of perfect equality? We've never seen two sticks or stones that are exactly equal in length or quality, yet we have an idea of equal itself. That, he says, came from before birth, when our souls beheld the pure form of equal, and we recall it when we encounter approximate equalities in life. Similarly, he suggests we recognize degrees of beauty or justice by comparing them to the perfect form of beauty or form of justice our soul once knew. This is Plato's theory of forms emerging, the idea that beyond the imperfect world of changeable things we perceive, there is a higher, unchanging reality, a realm of forms or ideas, eidos in Greek, which are the perfect archetypes of all properties and values. The physical world we know through the senses is only an imitation of the pure, eternal, and unchanging world of the forms. The forms are more real than the objects we see. They are invisible, eternal, and intelligible, known by the intellect, not the eyes. In Phaedo, this theory is woven into the discussion of the soul's immortality. The soul, being akin to the divine forms, can know them and, like them, is not destroyed when the body perishes. The Phaedo is thus a milestone. It gives us Plato's metaphysics forms and Plato's epistemology, learning as recollection of forms, in one narrative. It also doesn't shy from objections. Plato has two interlocutors. Simmias and Cebes raise thoughtful challenges. For example, Simmias suggests maybe the soul is like the harmony of a lyre, a beautiful result of the parts, but destroyed when the instrument is destroyed. Cebes worries that even if the soul outlasts the body, perhaps it wears out after many reincarnations. Socrates answers these, reinforcing the theory that the soul is an independent substance that pre-exists and outlives the body. At the dialogue's climax, Socrates recounts a mythic vision of the afterlife. Virtuous souls dwell on Earth's surface or even ascend to a pure realm of ideal forms, whereas impure souls are dragged back into bodily life. Finally, Socrates calmly drinks the hemlock and bids farewell, telling his grieving friends not to weep. His serenity in facing death, sustained by the conviction of the soul's immortality, provides a moving conclusion. The Phaedo establishes several major Platonic ideas: the immortality of the soul, the existence of transcendent forms, beauty, justice, equality, good, and so on, the notion that true knowledge is of these forms and comes from the soul's recollection of them, and the view that the philosophical life is a training for the soul's separation from the body, hence a preparation for death. We see Plato here building on Socratic ethics, care for one's soul through virtue and wisdom, and transforming it with a grand otherworldly framework. Virtue for Plato will increasingly mean aligning the soul with the eternal good and the order of the forms, rather than merely ethical behavior in day-to-day life. But before we get too far into abstraction, Plato will also turn to concrete questions of politics and society, most notably in his masterpiece, The Republic. It is in The Republic that Plato's philosophy reaches its fullest scope, tying together his metaphysics, ethics, psychology, epistemology, and political theory, and giving the world the unforgettable allegory of the cave. Plato's Republic is a monumental dialogue that has been hailed as one of Plato's longest dialogues and his magnum opus. Framed as a conversation mainly between Socrates and several friends, notably Plato's own brothers, the Republic begins with a straightforward question: what is justice, and is the just life happier than the unjust life? But it unfolds in a wide-ranging exploration of morality, politics, psychology, education, and metaphysics across its 10 books. The dialogue's dramatic setting is the house of Cephalus during an all-night festival, and it starts casually. Socrates speaking with the old gentleman Cephalus about old age and justice. Soon, however, Socrates finds himself challenged by the fiery Thrasymachus, who asserts that justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. Might makes right. Socrates and his interlocutors then embark on constructing an imaginary ideal city, Callipolis, as a way to see justice writ large before identifying it in the individual soul. This leads Plato to describe his vision of the best society and government, one ruled by philosopher kings. In the course of the Republic, Plato presents numerous influential ideas: the principle of specialization, each person doing the one thing they are naturally best suited for; the division of society into 3 classes, rulers, auxiliaries, or soldiers and producers; the tripartite soul theory, reason, spirit, and appetite as 3 parts of the individual psyche, mirroring the classes of society; the role of education and censorship; the equality of women, at least in the guardian classes; the communal life of the guardian, with property and even family held in common to avoid conflicts of interest; and the degeneration of political systems, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny. Plato does not shy from radical proposals. For example, abolishing the traditional family for the guardian class, or selecting mating festivals by lot, rigged to promote the best offspring. These are meant to eliminate factionalism and keep the rulers focused on the common good. While these aspects of the Republic are fascinating, we will focus on two of its most famous contributions, the concept of the philosopher king and the allegory of the cave, which together illustrate Plato's view of knowledge, reality, and leadership. By Book 5 of the Republic, Socrates has described a pretty austere utopia led by guardian elites, but his friends ask, who would ever be fit to rule such a city? Socrates answers with his boldest political idea. Unless philosophers become kings in the cities, or those whom we now call kings and rulers genuinely and adequately philosophize, there will be no rest from its ills in the cities. In other words, the only way to truly achieve a just society is to have philosopher kings, rulers who love wisdom, know the true forms of justice and goodness, and therefore can govern not by opinion or appetite, but by knowledge of what is truly best. This claim is startling to his listeners, and Socrates spends considerable effort explaining who the true philosophers are, distinguishing them from sophists or fake intellectuals, and why they are uniquely qualified to rule. Philosophers, he says, are those who are able to grasp what always is, the unchanging realities, the forms, as opposed to ordinary people who grope about in the realm of what comes into being and passes away, the transient sensory world. To convey this difference between knowledge and ignorance, Plato introduces three famous analogies in Republic Book 6 and 7, the sun, the divided line, and the cave. The form of the good is compared to the sun. Just as the sun in the visible world illuminates objects and enables sight, so the good illuminates the forms and gives truth to the knower. The divided line is a visual metaphor that segments reality and our awareness of it into four levels. At the lowest, imagination, shadows, reflections, then belief, physical things, then mathematical reasoning, abstract thought, and highest of all, dialectical understanding of the forms, culminating in the form of the good. But the most vivid and narrative of these is the allegory of the cave. In Book 7 of the Republic, Socrates asks Glaucon and us, the readers, to imagine a strange and powerful scene, an allegory that has become perhaps the most famous passage of all philosophy. The allegory of the cave. Picture an underground cave where humans have been imprisoned since childhood, chained by the legs and neck so they cannot move or turn their heads. They face a wall. Behind them a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners runs a walkway where others carry objects and puppets. The prisoners see only the shadows of these objects cast on the wall in front of them. They hear only echoes of voices, the people behind them speaking, which they naturally assume come from the shadows. Having never known anything else, these prisoners take the shadows to be the real things. They're like us, Socrates says poignantly, for we too often accept the world of our senses as the truth. Now imagine one prisoner is freed and compelled to stand up and turn around. At first, the firelight hurts his eyes, and the shapes he sees, the actual objects being carried, are confusing. He might prefer to turn back to the familiar shadows on the wall and believe those are more real. But suppose someone drags this prisoner out of the cave into the daylight above. Blinded by the sun at first, he gradually acclimates. First, he can only see shadows and reflections outside, ironically similar to what he saw in the cave. Then he sees things like trees, animals, people directly, and finally he can even look at the sun itself, realizing it is the source of light and life. This liberated prisoner undergoes a complete transformation of understanding. He now knows the shadows in the cave were mere illusions, and that a far richer, brighter reality exists outside. Feeling pity for his fellow prisoners, he goes back down into the cave to free them. But re-entering the darkness he can't see well, his eyes now used to the sun, and the prisoners laugh at him. They think the journey has ruined his sight and resist any attempts to be let out. In fact, if anyone tried to drag them out, they might fight and even kill that person. Socrates notes if they could lay hands on the escapee who returned, they'd kill him. A poignant reference to Socrates' own fate at the hands of the ignorant. This allegory brilliantly compresses Plato's philosophical worldview. The cave represents the world of appearances, the realm of ordinary perception and opinion. The shadows on the wall are the perceptions of sensory objects, which the unenlightened take as the most real things. The difficult descent out of the cave symbolizes education. The philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge, from illusion to reality. The outside world with the sun is the realm of true reality, the world of forms. The sun represents the form of the good, the ultimate principle that illuminates all the others. In Plato's theory, the good is the highest form that gives truth and being to the rest, just as the sun makes visible things exist and allows vision. The freed prisoner is the philosopher, who through reason and dialect comes to grasp the forms and attain knowledge. The return to the cave represents the philosopher's role in society. Having seen the truth, he has a duty to help enlighten others, even if they are hostile or incredulous. Plato thereby explains why philosophers are uniquely suited to rule. They have knowledge of the true realities, the forms of justice, goodness, and so on, whereas the majority only have opinions based on shadows. However, as he acknowledges the difficulty, people steeped in ignorance resist enlightenment. They're like us, the text says. Most of us are prisoners of our own limited perspective. The allegory thus carries not only epistemological meaning, the ascent to knowledge, but also a moral and political message. It dramatizes the philosopher's compassion and responsibility, and the society's need for true wisdom, even if it doesn't want it. From an academic perspective, the cave is often interpreted as an answer to the question, why study philosophy? It suggests that without philosophy, we are like prisoners mistaking shadows for reality. In other words, without critical thinking and the pursuit of truth, we live in ignorance. The cave dwellers' cognitive trap of ignorance is comfortable, and they do not know anything beyond the shadows, as one analysis puts it. They even engage in trivial games like guessing which shadow comes next, analogous to how people in our world might fixate on gossip or appearances or conspiracies. Plato's allegory dramatically illustrates the difference between appearance and reality, a core Platonic distinction. The world of senses, the cave, is a world of mere opinion. It's changing, incomplete, and can deceive us. The world of forms, outside the cave, is permanent, fully real, and knowable through reason. Education is the painful but rewarding process of turning the soul from darkness toward light. A striking moment is when Plato notes how the freed prisoner, returning, is ridiculed or even killed by the cave dwellers who think he's crazy. This is a thinly veiled reference to Socrates being executed by the Athenians who did not understand him. It also shows Plato's perhaps elitist viewpoint. The masses are deeply ignorant, though not by their own fault entirely, and they might violently resist very knowledge that would free them. This justifies, in Plato's mind, why philosophers, reluctant, enlightened leaders should hold power, even if unpopular. The philosopher kings will know what is truly good for the city, having seen the sun, the good itself. After the cave allegory, the Republic goes on to discuss the curriculum that would educate such philosopher rulers, including mathematics, dialect, and many years of gradual training. It also features a famous critique of art and poetry. Plato controversially argues that poets and artists are imitators of mere appearances, shadows of shadows, and that their work can corrupt the soul by feeding emotions and misrepresenting reality. He even suggests banning most of Homer and tragic poetry from the ideal city, except hymns to the gods and praises of good men. This is one of the earliest examinations of art's moral impact and has fueled debates about censorship and aesthetics for millennia. Additionally, in the final book, Socrates relates the myth of a story of a soldier who dies, visits the afterlife, and returns to tell of how souls choose their next lives, a kind of moral fable to encourage justice by showing rewards and punishments after death. The myth of brings the dialogue full circle by reinforcing that a just life is rewarded in the long run, whereas injustice ultimately leads to misery for the soul. In summary, the Republic gives us Plato's vision of a just society and a just soul. Justice, Plato concludes, is when each part performs its proper role. In the city, each class does its own work. Rulers rule with wisdom, soldiers uphold courage, producers exercise moderation by obeying the rulers. And in the individual, each part of the soul, reason, spirit, appetite, fulfills its function with reason in command. The just person is harmonious, with reason guiding spiritedness and desire toward good ends, a psychological mirroring of the well-ordered city. Such an individual will be truly happier than the tyrant who is ruled by lust or greed, just as a healthy body is better off than a diseased one. Plato thus answers the initial question. Justice is worthwhile for its own sake, as it aligns one's soul with the good. For a general audience, the Republic remains compelling, because of its mix of concrete social commentary. Some see it in early communism or feminism in the mention that women can be guardians too, and timeless abstract parables like The Cave. Academically, it has generated enormous commentary on its political feasibility, on the meaning of the forms and the good, on whether Plato's proposal is totalitarian or enlightened, on the role of education and censorship, and on the interpretative question of whether Plato himself endorsed every aspect or intended some irony, a debate known as the open question of how literally to take the ideal city. What is indisputable is that the Republic encapsulates Plato's conviction that philosophical wisdom and moral virtues are inseparable and are the only solid foundation for a good human life and society. The allegory of the cave stands as enduring testimony to the transformative power of philosophy. From ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light, a journey each of us is invited to undertake. Even as Plato developed profound metaphysics and political theory, he remained deeply interested in human love and the way it connects us to higher things. Two middle period dialogues, the Symposium and the Phaedrus, are devoted to eros, love or passionate desire, and they offer a fascinating blend of psychology, metaphysics, and even theology of love. These works present a more poetic and mythic side of Plato's thought, complementing the rigorous logic of dialogues like Republic or Phaedo. In fact, the Symposium, set as a banquet conversation, and the Phaedrus, set as a friendly chat outside the city walls, contain some of Plato's most beautiful writing. They also introduced the concept of Platonic love in its original sense, not just friends as pop culture uses the term, but rather a love that transcends the physical and aims at the ideal beauty. The Symposium takes place at a drinking party attended by Socrates and a group of notable Athenians, including the playwright Aristophanes and the handsome young tragedian Agathon. The guests agreed to each give a speech in praise of love, eros. The scenery allows Plato to showcase a variety of views on love. Aristophanes, for instance, delivers a humorous yet poignant myth about humans originally being double creatures split in half by Zeus, so that love is the search for our other half, an origin of the idea of soulmates. Others offer more conventional praise of the god of love. The climax is Socrates' turn. Instead of a speech of his own, he recounts the teachings of a wise woman, Diotima of Mantinea. Whether she is Plato's fictional invention or based on someone is unclear. Diotima gives a profound teaching on the nature and purpose of love, introducing what later commentators call the ladder of love. According to Diotima, via Socrates, all mortal creatures have an impulse to achieve immortality. For animals and humans, one route to immortality is biological, procreation, having children to carry on one's genes or name. But there is a higher kind of offspring for humans, the birth of ideas, virtue, and creations of the soul, such as art or legislation, that confer lasting fame. Love is the desire for immortality through the presence of good and beautiful. Diotima describes how a young person should be guided by love for lower to higher forms of beauty in a series of steps. This is the ladder. At first, one loves the beauty of a particular body. Then one realizes that many bodies have similar beauty, so one appreciates beauty in all bodies. Next, one comes to esteem the beauty of the soul more than the body, loving those who are beautiful in character. From there, one ascends to love beautiful activities and laws, seeing beauty in customs and institutions. Then to the beauty of knowledge and ideas. Finally, if one is guided correctly, one reaches a vision of beauty itself, an eternal, unchanging, pure beauty, not concrete or physical, but the very form of beauty. In Diotima's famous words, at the pinnacle of the ascent, the lover suddenly perceives something wonderfully beautiful in its nature, the form of beauty itself, eternal, not growing or decaying. The lover realizes that all particular beautiful things partake of this form of beauty. Platonic love is thus a kind of spiritual eros that begins with physical attraction but is ultimately aimed at the form of beauty and the birth of true virtue and wisdom in the soul. As Diotima says, if ever one gazes on the form of beauty itself, it will awaken a marvelous love, and one will want to give birth not to fleshly children, but to true virtue and become dear to the gods. In short, love is portrayed as a ladder of ascent to the divine, turning earthly desire into a path toward the eternal. The Symposium thus presents a philosophy of love where eros is a driving force that can be sublimated from physical desire to a love of the eternal and the good. It's a deeply optimistic view of love's potential. Love is not just a feeling or appetite, but a cosmic force that propels us toward wisdom and immortality, symbolically speaking. It's also worth noting that in the Symposium, Socrates credits a woman, Diotima, as his teacher in these matters, which is unique in Plato, and perhaps a nod to the idea that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. The dramatic ending of Symposium is also memorable. Alcibiades, a brilliant but drunken statesman, crashes the party and delivers a speech praising and teasing Socrates himself, likening Socrates to a Silenus figure, ugly on the outside but full of godlike images within, and confessing his unrequited love for Socrates. This adds a poignant human touch, showing Socrates as an object of eros, but one who sublimates it, never succumbing to mere physicality. Platonic love, in modern parlance meaning non-sexual affection, has its root in this idea. Socrates and Alcibiades have a form of love that is not consummated physically, which Socrates claims is because true love aims higher than the body. The Phaedrus, another dialogue centered on love and beauty, complements Symposium but has a different form. It features only Socrates and Phaedrus, a young admirer, talking outside the city, and it contains 2 speeches by Socrates on love, one critical and one celebratory, as well as discussions on rhetoric and writing. The most famous part of Phaedrus is the chariot allegory of the soul. Socrates describes the soul as a charioteer driving 2 horses. One horse is noble and good, representing the spirited part of the soul that can be guided by reason. The other is bad and unruly, representing the appetite part, base desires. The charioteer is reason. In the mythic vision, the souls of the gods have perfect horses and charioteers and dwell always in the realm above the heavens, where they behold the forms and especially the form of beauty. Human souls follow in the train of the gods, riding up to glimpse the forms, but the bad horse makes it difficult. In this wild metaphor, sometimes a soul gets a vision of true beauty, other times it struggles. Eventually, souls fall back to earth and are incarnated into bodies, and their experience of having seen the forms determines what kind of person they become. Philosophers saw more, so they are born with greater insight. Others saw less and became people attached to more base pursuits. Socrates then links this to love. When a person here on earth sees someone with physical beauty, it triggers a recollection of the true beauty their soul once saw. The soul's wings start to sprout in yearning for that higher reality. The good horse spirit is restrained, but the bad horse passion lunges, leading to inner conflict. If the charioteer reason could guide the whole soul to honor and cherish the beauty rightly, the lovers will practice philosophical self-control and sublimate their passion into virtue. If they cannot, they may give in to desire, but even a relationship that is chaste can be profoundly loving. Socrates implies the highest form of earthly love is a kind of platonic friendship where 2 souls inspire each other toward the form of beauty and the good, rather than merely satiating physical lust. This aligns with the Symposium's ladder but adds the imagery of the soul's ascent and fall. Plato's idea here is that love is a form of divine madness, one of our 4 kinds of divinely inspired madness he mentions, the others being prophetic, ritual, and poetic madness. Love's madness is a gift from the gods because it can propel the soul back toward its heavenly origin. The Phaedrus also has an interesting critique of writing. Socrates famously recounts the myth of the Egyptian god Thoth inventing writing and King Thamos criticizing it because it will make people rely on written words rather than their own memory and understanding. This often puzzles readers, since we only know Socrates through Plato's writing. Is Plato biting the hand that feeds him? The deeper point Plato makes is that writing is static and can't answer questions or defend itself. Live dialect is superior. But ironically, Plato's own dialogues try to overcome this by writing in a way that stimulates the reader's dialectical engagement, as if a written text could be as alive as conversation. From Symposium and Phaedrus, the key philosophical takeaway is Plato's theory of love. Love is fundamentally a desire for eternal beauty and goodness, and erotic love can be an elevating force if guided by philosophy. The notion of Platonic love, a love that transcends the physical and bonds soul together in pursuit of higher things, comes straight from these dialogues. They also contribute to Plato's understanding of the soul. The soul is immortal, again affirmed here, as only as an immortal soul could pre-exist and see the forms, and has parts that can conflict. The chariot allegory vividly conveys the tension within human nature, a theme that resonates with anyone who has felt reason and passion at odds. Academically, these dialogues have been analyzed for their psychology of love, their treatment of gender, and their poetic style. The Symposium, especially with its layered framing, invites questions about history versus myth. but historically these works have inspired views of love from early Christian thinkers who tried to merge Platonic love with spiritual love of God, to Renaissance philosophers, and even more modern concepts of romance that value the spiritual connection over the physical. In sum, Plato sees Eros as a powerful intermediary between the human and the divine. In Symposium, Diotima calls Eros a great daemon, spirit, that is the child of poverty and resource, always needy but clever at seeking fulfillment. The image captures the human condition. We are not gods, but through love, we reach out for something more enduring than ourselves. Love educates us, in the best case, turning desire into virtue. Thus, alongside reason, love is a central path to ascending the ladder of knowledge in Plato's philosophy. Plato's late dialogues reflect an aging philosopher turning to review and refine his earlier ideas, as well to venture into new territory, such as formal logic, science, and law. These works are generally more difficult and were likely written in the last decade of Plato's life. While not all can be discussed in equal detail, we can highlight a few: the Parmenides, Theaetetus, Sophist, Statesman, Timaeus, and Laws. In them, Plato shows a willingness to critique his own doctrines, especially the theory of forms, and to address practical and scientific questions more directly. In Parmenides, Plato daringly casts his young hero Socrates in a conversation with the venerable Eleatic philosopher Parmenides. The dialogue reads almost like Plato debating himself. Parmenides examines Socrates' theory that there are forms, one over many, and systematically hits it with tough objections. For instance, he raises what became known as the third man argument against the form of largeness. If large things are large by sharing in the form of large, then mustn't we posit another form to account for the largeness that the form of large and particularly large things share, and so on ad infinitum. He also questions how forms, which are changeless, can relate to changing things, and how we can know forms at all if they're in a separate realm. Does the human mind have a form of mind that touches the others? These puzzles are raised and not overly answered by Plato. Indeed, Parmenides ends without resolution after Parmenides puts Socrates through a rigorous exercise in dialectic, considering all consequences of assuming a one or not one. The effect of this dialogue is to show that Plato was aware of potential logical problems with his own middle period theories. Scholars still debate whether Plato intended specific solutions or was possibly indicating a shift in his thinking. Regardless, Parmenides is a treasure trove for understanding the challenges of a two-world metaphysics and has spurred countless commentaries on the forms. The Theaetetus is another gem of the late period, focused on epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Socrates meets young Theaetetus, who would become a noble mathematician, and asks, what is knowledge? The dialogue examines three answers. Knowledge is perception. Knowledge is true belief. Knowledge is true belief with an account, logos, essentially anticipating the idea of justified true belief. Each of these gets refuted or at least found inadequate. If knowledge was simply perception, then truth would be entirely subjective. Each person's perception is truth for them, which Socrates argues is self-defeating, because if all opinions are true, then the opinion that not all opinions are true must also be true, a contradiction. If knowledge is true belief, Socrates points out that one can have true belief by luck or persuasion without actually knowing. Like a juror convinced by rhetoric might have a true belief about what happened, but we hesitate to say he knows. The addition of an account or explanation seems promising. Knowledge has justified true belief, but problems arise in defining what counts as an adequate account. The dialogue explores an image of trying to distinguish pieces of wind drone in one's mind. In the end, Theaetetus concludes in aporia, without a final definition of knowledge. Yet it's an enormously rich dialogue that maps out the field of epistemology for future generations. Notably, Plato here does not invoke forms or the recollection doctrine overtly. The dialogue stays at the level of everyday and logical analysis, which some interpret as Plato stepping back from his earlier certainty about how we know things. Perhaps he's acknowledging the complexity of defining knowledge and the role of perception and true belief within it. For the modern reader, Theaetetus is fascinating as an ancient precursor to debates about empiricism versus rationalism and the nature of justification. Sophist and Statesman, sometimes called Politicus, are a pair of dialogues where an Eleatic stranger takes the lead. Socrates is mostly silent, present only as a character who listens. In Sophist, The stranger and young Theaetetus try to define a sophist. This leads them into a rather technical examination of dialectical method and a venture into ontology, the philosophy of being and not being. Plato wrestles with the concept of non-being to explain how false statements are possible. The stranger introduces a theory that which is not, in a sense, is namely as difference. For example, not being does not mean total nothingness, but being other than something. Thus, falsehood can be explained as saying something is in a way that it is not, like predicating something that is different from the truth. This might sound obtruse, but it's Plato's response to Parmenides' strict idea that one cannot speak or think of what is not, since doing so would grant it existence. Plato basically invents a rudimentary theory of categories or forms of predication here, distinguishing between being, sameness, difference, motion, rest, the greatest kinds. It's a sign of his late interest in logic and language. The statesman continues the method of definition, this time trying to pin down what a true statesman is. Using a lengthy analogy of weaving, the statesman weaves together the fabric of society, balancing courage and moderation in citizens. While not as widely read today, statesman contains reflection on laws and governance that prefigure law's dialogue. The Timaeus is unique in Plato's corpus. It is his foray into cosmology and natural philosophy. Whereas most dialogues are about ethics or knowledge or love, Timaeus gives a grand account of the creation of the universe. It is set as a kind of sequel to Republic. At one point, Socrates says, "Yesterday we described the ideal city. Now let's hear about the universe," and features a single long speech by Timaeus of Locri, a Pythagorean philosopher. In this speech, Plato, through Timaeus, describes how a divine demiurge, craftsman god, fashioned the cosmos as a living creature with a soul by imposing mathematical order on chaotic pre-existing matter. The demiurge is supremely good and wanted everything to be as good as possible. Using the eternal forms as blueprints, he brings order out of disorder. For example, he creates the world's soul by mixing elements of sameness, difference, and being, and he arranges the stars, suns, and planets to create time. For time is the moving image of eternity, in Plato's famous phrase. The four classical elements, earth, air, fire, water, are explained in terms of regular geometric solids, a striking proto-scientific idea that matter is composed of tiny triangles forming the Platonic solids, cubes, tetrahedron, and so on, each corresponding to an element. Timaeus even includes an account of human anatomy and physiology, attributing various parts of the body to the god's craftsmanship, like the liver as an organ of divination, the marrow as seed of generation, and so on. It's a bizarre but fascinating mix of scientific reasoning. Some see hints of atomism and embryology and mythic imagination. Importantly, Plato makes clear that this cosmology is a likely story, meaning it is not to be taken as absolute revelation, but as a plausible account given our limited understanding. He acknowledges that knowledge of the physical world can only be conjectural, since only the forms offer certainty. Nonetheless, the Timaeus was hugely influential, especially in antiquity and the Middle Ages, as one of the few detailed creation accounts in Greek philosophy. It even influenced early Christian thinkers for its idea of a divine creator imposing order. In the context of Plato's ideas, Timaeus reinforces the certainty of the forms and the good. The demiurge uses the form of the good as a model. And it introduces the notion of necessity versus reason. The world is a product of the rational plan of the demiurge, but also the necessary laws of the material realm. In the context of Plato's ideas, Timaeus reinforces the centrality of the forms and the good. The demiurge uses the form of the good as a model, and it introduces the notion of necessity versus reason. The world is a product of the rational plan of the demiurge, but also the necessary laws of the material realm. The demiurge persuades necessity to cooperate via shapes and numbers, indicating that the cosmos is built by geometric and mathematical principles. The demiurge persuades necessity to cooperate via shapes and numbers, indicating that the cosmos is built by geometric and mathematical principles. This links to the Pythagorean influence on Plato, the belief that mathematical order underlies reality. Finally, Plato's Laws is his last and longest work, often seen as a more practical follow-up to Republic. In Laws, Plato abandons the character of Socrates entirely. Instead, the dialogue is a conversation between an unnamed Athenian stranger, who likely voices Plato's own late views, and two old men, a Spartan and a Cretan, as they take a long hike on Crete. They discuss how to found a new colony and what its laws should be. The tone is quite different from Republic, more legalistic and detailed. Plato seemingly accepts the actual cities will never be run by philosopher kings, so Laws outlines the second best state, one governed by laws and a mixed constitution. The Athenian stranger still aims to shape a virtuous citizenry, but through rigid laws and social institutions rather than through philosopher rulers. Laws covers everything from marriage, education, and drinking parties to criminal law, economic regulation, and religious rights. It's almost a legal code in dialogue form, complete with the reasoning behind each ordinance given in the form of preambles to laws. In fact, one notable idea is that every law should be preceded by a persuasive prelude explaining why the law is just and good. Plato thus acknowledges the educative value of written law by giving citizens rational explanations. The laws themselves teach virtue, not just coerce behavior. This is a very Platonic touch. Even in laying down rules, he wants to appeal to reason and the soul's understanding. Compared to Republic, the government described in Laws is more conservative and less idealistic. Why this shift? Perhaps Plato, in old age, had become more cautious after seeing the failure of the Syracuse experiments and the general resistance to philosopher kings. In Laws, he explicitly plans a city called Magnesia, where the rulers are not full-fledged philosophers. They don't know the forms, but are guided by the law and a sort of civic religion. There is a nocturnal council of senior officials who study philosophy and theology by night to keep the city on course, an interesting compromise. Laws is less frequently read than Republic, partly because its dry detail can be tedious, but it is invaluable for understanding Plato's late political thought. It shows him trying to apply his principles to a real-worldish scenario. The tone is stern. For instance, Laws advocates for state control of education, discourages innovation in music and arts to avoid moral decay, and imposes fairly harsh penalties for various crimes. It also stands out for being one of the earliest treatises to claim the law should rule rather than any individual. The rule of law concept, something even Republic's philosopher-king regime didn't emphasize because the king's knowledge was the law there. In Laws, however, Plato writes if law is the master of the government, and the government is its slave, then the situation is safe and good, implying that no person, unless divine, can be trusted with absolute power. This is a notable development. One might ask, is Laws a repudiation of Republic? Plato seems to say that his ideal in Republic was too high for ordinary humans. Laws is a pragmatic second best. Indeed, the Athenian stranger in Laws explicitly calls it second after the ideal of a truly wise ruler. A revealing line is when the Athenian says that in the ideal case, where people are perfectly virtuous, no laws are needed, but since we don't have divine rulers, we must tie them down with laws like puppets, guided by a divine code. The dialogue ends somewhat abruptly with a prayer to the gods to bless the proposed city. For academics, Laws demonstrates the evolution of Plato's thinking and has been studied as an early work in jurisprudence and political theory. It contains, for example, the first elaborate discussion of criminal law in philosophy. Plato distinguishes types of homicide, intentions, and so on. It's less idealistic and more empirical, perhaps reflecting Plato's gathering of information about how actual Cretan and Spartan laws worked. In the late period, one can sense Plato's mind ranging freely over all subjects: logic in Parmenides and Sophist, physics and cosmology in Timaeus, and practical governance in Laws. He also wrote Philebus, a dialogue about the nature of pleasure and the good life, where he ultimately argues that neither pure pleasure nor pure intellect is sufficient. The best life is a mixture of intelligence and measured pleasures with intellect ruling, introducing the idea of a quantitative limit to pleasures. And there are the Critias fragment about Atlantis and Epinomes as a kind of appendix to Laws. Plato's style in the late works is often more didactic and less playful than in earlier dialogues. Socrates is no longer the only voice of wisdom. Plato is experimenting with different modes of exposition. From the youthful portrayal of Socrates in Apology to the cosmic vision of Timaeus and the legislative project of Laws, Plato's dialogues cover an outstanding range. Yet they form a coherent journey. In each stage of his life, Plato sought to illuminate the question, how should we live in the light of what is ultimately real and good? Early on, he set the moral and intellectual stage with Socratic questioning. In the middle, he posited a visionary answer that we should live guided by the eternal forms, by the true, the good, the beautiful, and organize our souls and societies accordingly. In the late period, he tested and refined these ideas, acknowledging human limitation but still striving for the best attainable order. Plato's theories of forms, though criticized even in antiquity, remains one of the great strokes of philosophical genius. It offers a way to think about universals, ideals, and objective values. When we talk today about something being ideal or perfect, or when mathematicians speak of perfect circles or infinite sets that no one ever fully sees, we are to some extent speaking platonically. His concept of a reality beyond appearances laid groundwork for metaphysics and even theological thinking. Plotinus and later Neoplatonists interpreted Plato's form of the good as akin to divine principle. Plato's allegory of the cave still resonates in any context where people feel stuck in ignorance or illusion, whether one applies it to media culture, like citizens glued to flickering TV shadows in a dark room, or the need for education to liberate and enlighten. The cave allegory has been used to discuss everything from the persistence of conspiracy theories, mistaking shadows for reality, to the journey of personal growth. In ethics and politics, Plato set the terms of debate by insisting that questions of how to live must consider the health of the soul and the objective good. His distrust of democracy, born from seeing it condemn Socrates and flounder in war, and his idea of philosopher kings have been hotly debated. Today, we still struggle with how to ensure knowledgeable governance. Plato's solution was extreme, but his diagnosis of demagoguery and ignorant mass opinion seems prescient. The Republic's critique of poetry and art as mere imitation spurred responses by Aristotle and others, and much later gave fodder to debates about art's role. Should art challenge or uphold moral truths? Plato took a stance. Art is suspect unless aligned with truth that many disagree with, but grappling with his challenge helped define aesthetics as a discipline. Plato's influence on subsequent philosophy is immeasurable. His student Aristotle would diverge on many points, especially rejecting forms existing apart from things, but Aristotle's system is in dialogue with Plato's at every turn. In late antiquity, during the Renaissance, the revival of Plato contributed to new ideas about love, like Platonic love, as understood by Marsilio Ficino and others, and even scientific rationalism took some Platonic cues. Galileo and Kepler were fascinated by Plato's mathematical view of nature. Kepler described astronomers leaving the cave of Earth to see cosmic order. Academically, Plato's dialogues continue to be analyzed line by line. The Stanford Encyclopedia notes how exploratory and multidimensional Plato is, refusing to reduce philosophy to a dry system. This is why we keep reading him. Each dialogue is not just an argument but a literary drama inviting reinterpretation. For example, is the Republic primarily about individual morality or utopian politics, or both? Is the symposium more about love or about the nature of philosophy itself, with Socrates as the ultimate beloved? Different eras have found new meanings. In closing, perhaps the best way to appreciate Plato is to recall the scene at the end of Phaedo. Socrates, having given his final teaching on the immortality of the soul and the form of life, calmly drinks poison and dies among friends, saying his last words, a reminder to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, as if death is a cure for the illness of life. Plato wasn't present. He notes Plato was sick that day, but he memorialized his teacher with such power that readers for 2,400 years feel they were in that Athenian jail room. Plato's writings thus heal in a way. They aim to cure us of ignorance. By engaging us in dialogue, by challenging us to question appearances, those shadows on the wall, and ascend towards truth, Plato stimulates the philosophical impulse in his audience. In these episodes, we have followed Plato's journey, from the gadfly in Athens to the visionary in the academy. But the journey he really cares about is the one inside each reader's soul, turning it from darkness to light. In that sense, Plato's true academy is not just a location in Athens. It is wherever people gather to earnestly discuss and seek wisdom. And through his dialogues, that academy is still open, inviting us to become lovers of wisdom, philosophers in our own right. Thank you all for listening, and hope you all enjoyed. Until the next one.